My name is Russ Hanson. I'm the chair of the Department of Political Science. And I just want to tell you one important thing. If you need a parking pass, then you should see Christy Gillenwater after the talk is and the talk will be perhaps 40 minutes, 45 minutes on that order, and then there will be time for a robust question and answer period afterwards. The introduction will be given by a member of the Department of Political Science, but also a recently retired Vice President for the Office of International Affairs and now Special Assistant to the President of Columbia University, Dr. Patrick O'Meara.
I'm so delighted to welcome Roy Norton. You know, it's special to have a visitor from Canada with a diplomatic background. I've just done an hour interview with him, which will be aired later on WFIU. And I was commenting that I've done many such interviews, but I've never done a Canadian diplomat. This was the first one. And in some ways, I think this is sort of symptomatic of the general attitude that we have towards Canada. We kind of take it for granted. It's our ally, it's our friend, it's across the border. You called it your sunbelt, that the US is your sunbelt.
What I actually said is that 90% of us live within 100 miles of the US border. That area in Canada is our sunbelt, i.e. as far south as you can get.
Yes. So I think it's appropriate that we should learn more about Canada, and especially from someone who has special expertise. In looking at Roy Norton's credentials, I'm delighted that he's one of us, which I think is an important thing. He's an academic. I should be calling you Dr. Norton, because he studied, first of all, at Carleton University in Canada. From there, he did his master's degree at Harvard at the Kennedy School of Government. And then went to one of my favorite places in Washington, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, which is a remarkable place because it's there at the nation's capital and it brings in all of these leading congressional people and diplomats to meet with the students. And he did a doctorate there. And in my interview this morning, I asked you whether it was valuable to have done a doctorate. And I was delighted to hear you say, yes, it was, and it's been useful to me. And you did it later in life, right? It was not immediately after going to college. So in principle, he is the representative for Canada, based in Detroit, with special responsibility for Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. He's had a wonderful background, including responsibility in the Canadian Parliament, in the Canadian government's relations with the US Congress, and he's worked at the embassy as well in Washington, and he's been a protocol officer for the state of Ontario. So I'm particularly pleased because of the special connection that he has referred to in terms of Indiana, the state of Indiana. And that's been a remarkable thing for me to see more about. 162,300 jobs in the Hoosier state depend on the Canada-Indiana trade relationship. That's a remarkable statistic, and I'm sure you'll say more about the special relationship with the state of Indiana. And we tend to forget that Canada and the state of Indiana are bound together in a trade relationship that is more significant for the state than any other worldwide connection. So I'm very pleased today and very honored to welcome you to the Bloomington campus. We look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Dr. O'Meara. Thank you, Dr. O'Meara. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to pay particular thanks to the principal organizers of this, Christine Davis, the Associate Director of Indiana University's Center for International Business, Education and Research, Dr. Hanson, Chair of the IU Department of Political Science, and Christy Gillenwater, President of the and CEO of the Greater Bloomington Chamber of Commerce. When we put the request in the first instance to the Bloomington's Chamber, Greater Bloomington's Chamber last December, I guess it was. I didn't know that we were approaching the Chamber of the Year, the Indiana Chamber of the Year, but it turns out that we were. And I'm flattered to be able to speak to some members of the Chamber, and especially to be at Indiana University. I met on Wednesday in Indianapolis with your Senator Vi Simpson, the minority leader, who chided me for not having gotten to Bloomington earlier than this in my 18 months so far as Consul General of Canada. I've been to Indianapolis a few times. I've been elsewhere in the state, and indeed this week we declared, because I'm spending a week in Indiana, to be Canada Week in Indiana. I'm not sure that anybody else is regarding it as such. You'll see no television commercials pronouncing that it's Canada Week in Indiana. But if I'm spending a week in Indiana, that makes it Canada Week, and it began in South Bend on Sunday night. I spoke to the St. Joseph Chamber there on Monday morning, gave a presentation at University of Notre Dame in the afternoon. Pattern continued pretty much in West Lafayette and at Purdue on Tuesday. Hosted a reception Tuesday evening for Indiana legislators and others, including folks in this room, and then went off to my first ever college basketball game. I would have liked that to have been in Bloomington, but the schedule didn't work out, so I saw the Butler Bulldogs demolish the University of Illinois Chicago. That was fun. I think I will spend more time at college basketball games going forward, including back here on a subsequent trip in Bloomington. And then we went off to Warsaw, which I hadn't known beforehand is the orthopedics capital of North America. Population 14,000, with 3 companies there having revenues of $8 billion in north central Indiana, including operations in Canada. And then to Fort Wayne for a presentation to their chamber, and that continued in the afternoon with remarks at IPFW. And then we came here last night, had a delightful hour with Dr. O'Mara this morning. Was intrigued to find that I was the first Canadian that he's interviewed, and yes, I think you're right. That is a reflection of the fact that we have such a wonderful and relatively seamless relationship, Canada and Indiana, that we aren't ever the flavor of the month. We're not especially exotic. Canadians are just there. We're good friends, allies, consistently reliable, and we rather like to have a relationship of that nature with the United States of America and with the Hoosiers, and we hope it will very much continue. I've been Consul General to the industrial heartland of the U.S., Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, since September of 2010. I've made 4 trips here prior to Canada Week, and have had a couple of good meetings with your governor during that period of time. Spoke a year ago to your House of Representatives, as in the whole House was there. That was a bit of a rush. There were some things that I think they didn't know about the Indiana-Canada relationship, and maybe, for that matter, some things that you don't know about it, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. I'm also going to give a little bit of a context, an historical context, as it were, to the relationship that exists. On those previous visits, I've visited companies in Columbus, in Greenfield, in Indianapolis that do business in Canada. I've lectured a couple of times at Ball State, both in Muncie and in Indianapolis, and have really established what we consider to be excellent working relationships with the Indiana Chamber and the Manufacturers Association. And I think I will be back with some frequency, so you can count on seeing me again if you're inclined. We'll conclude Canada Week tonight in Indianapolis. I'm hosting a number of prominent Hoosiers at a function. We use Dennis Moore and Ann Cascadden, colleagues of mine from the consulate, highly valuable colleagues, very responsible for organizing many of the elements of this trip. Dennis is our cultural counselor, as it were, and we use Canadian culture oftentimes as the occasion to access folks. Tonight, there's a particularly good example of that. The Canadian circus without animals, Cirque du Soleil, is performing its Michael Jackson, the Immortal World Tour in Indianapolis. Michael Jackson, of course, comes from Indiana. Cirque du Soleil comes from Canada. It's a perfect blending for a Canadian diplomat spending some time in your state, and so it just seemed inevitable that we should take advantage of it. There are a lot of communities in your state. I can't get to them all, haven't yet been to them all, can't get to them all during Canada Week, and so we'll come back for your annual Super Bowl, aka the Indianapolis 500, in late May, and on that occasion we'll go down to Evansville and speak to the chamber there and visit some other communities in the south. All of this in aid of keeping up the profile. We're not particularly trying to resolve any irritants, because again, there aren't any significant irritants. But it's important from our point of view to keep the profile up, and I particularly valued the opportunity to meet with Dr. O'Meara on air this morning in that context. It's a special partnership that we enjoy, a special relationship, and it has been for a long time. From the Canadian perspective, I think it's safe to say almost everything about our development as a nation has happened in recognition of the US reality. I used the term with Dr. O'Meara this morning, we're obsessed with you. We are a population today of 34 million, you a population in excess of 300 million. You're the world superpower, we aren't. We sell 70% of what we sell to the world to you. We're your best customers, I'll get into more of that. But you have been, ever since your founding, a reality that Canadians have had to recognize the existence of, have wanted to recognize the existence of, and it's worked out pretty well, I think, for both of us. Arguably, because of where we are, we had to begin to take account 100 years before the rest of the world, 100 years before you became a superpower, of the US reality. Relative to the rest of the world, we're both pretty young countries, the United States and Canada. Your history began, as a nation, began in revolution against the United Kingdom 236 years ago this year. And 200 years ago, this June, you declared war on the United Kingdom, effectively us. The War of 1812 involved a declaration of war by the United States against the United Kingdom, but it was fought exclusively in North America. It forged, that war did, a Canadian identity. If not yet a Canadian nation, that didn't happen for another 55 years. The Treaty of Ghent that ended the War of 1812 in 1814 saw Britain relinquish the territorial gains that it had made during the war. So did the United States. Canadians learned something in the process about the colonial power, which of course was in the United Kingdom, and the world's superpower, and about national interest. The geopolitical priority then, as now, of good relations with the United States was paramount. This recurring theme has underpinned the ensuing 200 years of our shared history. Once peace had been established and borders were clearly defined, there followed years of concern in Canada that the neighbor to the south, you, might one day become an invader again. These fears were exacerbated by President Monroe's doctrine of 1823 and the advent of US Manifest Destiny in the 1840s, which of course was used to justify the war with Mexico. Canadian business interests, meanwhile, were growing in their recognition that the United States, going forward, would be a far more natural and likely far more profitable market than the mother country, the United Kingdom. In 1848, leaders of the Montreal business community, which at the time was by far Canada's largest, proclaimed an annexation manifesto calling for nothing less than commercial union with the United States. That led in 1854 to a treaty of reciprocity between the British North American colonies and the United States, with each side removing duties on a lengthy list of mostly agricultural products and natural resources. Reciprocal access was provided quite extensively to North American fisheries. British and American shipping had access on equal terms to the St. Lawrence River, the Canadian canals, and Lake Michigan. Trade more than doubled over the next 10 years. Whether precisely as a result of that reciprocity treaty, we'll never know for sure, because this region was booming at the time. Railways were being constructed in the US Midwest, and of course there was huge demand that was created by your Civil War. Notwithstanding the 1854 reciprocity treaty, disputes did arise from time to time between the US and Canada, especially pertaining to fisheries. In fact, there's rarely been a time since US independence where there's not been a fisheries dispute of greater or lesser magnitude between our two jurisdictions. Hardly surprising given the vast coastal and inland waters that we share and the difficulty in drawing and completely agreeing on boundaries. Parenthetically, we have a small handful of lingering boundary disputes to this day, the largest of which is over an area the size of Connecticut in the Beaufort Sea northeast of Alaska. Ironically, as demand and business opportunity grew, US companies became more protectionist. The US government abrogated the 1854 Reciprocity Treaty in 1866. As a result, the option of closer economic relations between our countries was taken off of the table, at least for the time being. It was roughly at that time that the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia came together, still under British sovereignty, and created the Dominion of Canada in 1867. Sir John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister, our George Washington in every sense but the military one, served as head of government in Canada for 19 years over the period from 1867 to 1891. His government favored protection of infant Canadian industries with high tariffs. It took us a century before we got over those protectionist impulses and recognized the importance to job creators of open markets. Let's jump ahead for the time being, fully that century, to 1984, when Brian Mulroney became Prime Minister of Canada, having fought his election partly on the need to restore the somewhat bruised relations with the United States, and I'll come back to that as well. Mulroney was a businessman. For 6 years prior to his becoming leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, as it was then known, he had been president of the Iron Ore Company of Canada, a subsidiary of a US multinational. He was a deal maker, and he never met anyone whom he could not charm, including Ronald Reagan. On the single issue that came to define the Mulroney government's relations with the United States, pursuit of a US-Canada Free Trade Agreement, the Prime Minister's warm personal relations with President Reagan and with other key members of the administration were instrumental in overcoming both the inertia and the skepticism with which official Washington often confronts opportunities like that one. A little background. Under Prime Minister Lester Pearson, who was Prime Minister of Canada from 1963 to 68, and President Lyndon Baines Johnson, Canada and the United States had already entered into what became known as the Auto Pact, short for Automotive Pact, in 1965. The Pact greatly benefited the large American car makers, the Detroit Three. Tariffs on cars, trucks, buses, tires, and auto parts were removed between our two countries. In exchange, the Detroit Three agreed that automobile production in Canada would not fall below 1964 levels and that they would assure the same production to sales ratio in Canada. This facilitated economies of scale, greatly enhancing industry efficiency. The Auto Pact worked well for both countries. In Canada, it became Exhibit A as to why free trade with the United States was not only non-threatening, but was likely to succeed. Mulroney decided in 1985 to take the plunge. He opted to pursue a deal, effectively confronting for the first time since the 1911 election in Canada what had been a third rail in Canadian politics, whether and the extent to which we would have an open, protection-free trading relationship with the United States. A free trade agreement was reached with the US in 1988, following 3 years of hard negotiations that frequently came close to failure. Shortly after the implementation of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, Canada, the US, and Mexico negotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement, creating the largest free trade area in the world. NAFTA, I should add, is not nearly as controversial, wasn't then, isn't now, in Canada as it is in the United States. Now, you've just gotten a thumbnail version of what it took me much longer to say last month at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Let's put history behind us, but just for a moment, and look at the picture as it is today. The economic fundamentals in Canada are sound. We've got the lowest debt to GDP ratio of any country in the G7. In fact, it's only half as high as the next lowest. Our corporate tax rate and employment taxes are also the lowest in the G7. We've created, essentially, a nationwide duty-free zone for manufacturing inputs. We're down to the short strokes in negotiating a free trade agreement with the European Union, one that will complement the other agreements that we have in place and that will position Canada exceptionally well as a platform for trade into the United States and Mexico or into the EU. We're well positioned as a result of these sound economic fundamentals to continue to be the world's biggest single consumer of US-made goods and services. I say continue to be because we already are, we have been for the longest time, and every indicator is that we will be for a long time into the future. Our relative economic success, therefore, is important to Americans. It means jobs here in the United States, and in fact, right here in Indiana, as Dr. O'Meara said earlier, a statistic that I might repeat. Job growth is critical anywhere. Any political leader anywhere is consumed with job growth as an important contributor and reflection of economic success. Canada is contributing to job growth in the US, and we can do more, we believe. One of my messages, certainly during Canada Week in Indiana, has been along these lines, to make our two countries, and especially this Great Lakes region, much stronger in the future. Michael Porter, Harvard Business School economist, spoke last June at a conference organized by the Detroit Regional Chamber of Commerce in Mackinac, northern Michigan. He implored on that occasion his business audience, first and foremost, to recognize where the region is geographically and to take full advantage of proximity to Canada. Trade between Indiana and my country, as Dr. O'Meara said, is responsible for 162,300 jobs in the state of Indiana. That's based on a standard macroeconomic model that the Canadian Embassy updates every couple of years, meaning that 1 in every 17 employed Hoosiers owes their employment to trade with Canada, a country that, as again Dr. O'Meara acknowledged, doesn't necessarily feature every day in people's consciousness. More than 16,000 jobs in Indiana's 9th Congressional District, which is right here in Bloomington, depend on trade between your state and my country. And what we're proposing to do in the energy sector and on critical infrastructure will create tens of thousands of additional jobs in Indiana and will help ensure a climate of confidence that should maintain the security of existing jobs. Canada is Indiana's #1 export destination by a large margin. In fact, Indiana exports more to Canada than to your next 7 global destinations put together. We hear lots of talk of the so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. They've got a population between them of 2.7 billion. The Canadian provinces, the 2 largest provinces in Canada of Ontario and Quebec, have a population of 21 million. Indiana, and for that matter, the United States, sells more to those 2 provinces than you do to the BRIC countries' population, 2.7 billion. The United States exports more to Canada than to all the countries of the European Union, population more than 500 million. We're the #1 export destination for 35 of the 50 US states, including Indiana. Indiana's exports, the 2011 numbers are just out as of the day before yesterday. Indiana's exports to Canada increased 7.5%, closer to 8%, in 2011 over 2010. Total trade, $18.5 billion. Indiana has a $4 billion trade surplus with Canada. We're the only one of your top 8 trading partners globally with which Indiana has a trade surplus. That doesn't bother us in Canada. We hope that it satisfies you folks in Indiana. Believe it or not, we have consistently been Indiana's largest export destination and trade partner. It should be clear to everyone that if President Obama's declared goal of doubling U.S. exports over the next 5 years, and actually the U.S. is on track to achieve this, is to be achieved with all of the attendant job creation benefits, increased sales to Canada will be a critically important contributor. Already, U.S. exports to my country grew more in 2010, this is a bit of a dated statistic, than they did to the rest of the world, which no doubt is why the President's Export Council visited Canada last June, the first time that they've ever had a meeting abroad. The macro numbers speak for themselves. This is a vitally important trading relationship from which both countries benefit enormously. Data at the level of the firm is equally impressive. It substantiates that unlike trade between Indiana and any other jurisdiction worldwide, US-Canada trade is almost fully integrated. Approximately a third of everything that we sell to one another is within companies, as in parent companies trading with subsidiary companies on either side of the border. Another third is within established supply chains. This especially pertains in the automotive and advanced manufacturing sectors. The phenomenon takes ever deeper root as companies invest on the other side of the border. Aided and abetted by our strong currency, and this is the scourge of Canadian exporters to a certain extent, but nonetheless, our currency is now, and has been for a little while, at par with the US dollar. Canadian, and with the relative soundness of the Canadian banking system, no Canadian banks either failed or required assistance during the recent Great Recession, as it were. Canadian companies are investing more in the United States, including in Indiana. More than 90 Canadian companies already own over 400 businesses operating in this state, with about 12,000 Hoosiers employed at those companies, 3,700 of those in the 9th Congressional District of Indiana. And prominent Hoosier companies, Eli Lilly, CTS, Zimmer, Steel Dynamics, Cummins, Hillrom, and others, all operate within the Canada-Indiana supply chain. I'm always struck, not offended, just struck, at the extent to which these companies organize themselves in a way in which Canada is not considered part of their international division. We are regarded as if we were Kentucky or Ohio or Michigan. That might bother Canadian nationalists. It doesn't bother Canadian businesses who know how integrated our operations are. They know that Canada does not compete with the United States on wages, on labor, on health, or environmental standards. Meaning, to put it bluntly, we aren't another country starting with C, or any of those other countries that periodically occasion policy actions that once taken have the effect sometimes, I believe inadvertently, I hope inadvertently, of sideswiping Canadian interests. What Canadian businesses do get upset about, and for that matter the Canadian population to a certain extent gets upset about, are instances, examples in US or state law that discriminate against Canadian supplied goods or services. The most absurd examples arose during the recent stimulus program federally, the Recovery Act, when there actually were United States companies that were denied the opportunity to bid on US taxpayer-funded programs because they sourced an amount from their subsidiary in Canada that put them over the eligible threshold of 25% foreign content, and as a result were not able to participate in your stimulus package. If you subscribe to the view that this region, meaning Indiana, the US industrial Midwest, and central Canada, has all of the know-how necessary to lead the globe in making things, then policy making that accounts for the interests of the integrated region becomes vitally important. To paraphrase Michael Porter, we are where we are in geographic terms, and there's no advantage to any of us pretending that we're somewhere else. Together we should maximize the advantages that our like-minded countries enjoy. Now there's a little bit of an economic and trade outlook, strong and destined, I think, to become stronger. Let's take a look at North American and world security, the partnership that our two countries share in that regard. I'll step back again as a result to the late 1940s, after our two countries had stood as great allies during the two world wars. Seeds of US-Canadian defense cooperation that blossomed during World War II led directly to full Canadian participation in the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949, and of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, based in Colorado Springs, in 1958, the latter probably being Canada's most important military agreement. Our two countries fought alongside one another on the UN force in Korea, further cementing military bonds, and those bonds have only grown since. There are 4 countries with which the United States is comfortable sharing almost all intelligence and the status of military planning, Canada foremost among them. And we continue to turn to the United States to meet most of our major defense procurement needs. On November 4th, 1979, Iranian radicals seized the US Embassy in Tehran. Several US diplomats and their spouses managed to escape that day to the Canadian Embassy. We secluded them for almost 3 months, equipping them with Canadian identities and passports, which made it possible for them to board a plane to Switzerland at the end of January of 1980. This operation, which obviously involved a great deal of risk to people on the ground, was overseen by Canada's first female foreign minister, the Honourable Flora MacDonald, and by my former boss, then Prime Minister Joe Clark. Over a generation later, as multiple tragedies unfolded on September the 11th, it's important to note that the deputy commander of NORAD in Colorado Springs, who was in charge that day because the commander, the US commander, was away, was Canadian. The deputy commander is always Canadian. It was he, therefore, who was responsible for bringing down all air traffic across North America in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. More than 230 US-bound planes were landing in Canada. They couldn't fly on into the United States because it was perceived that there was potential great risk. Nobody knew, as those planes might approach the United States, what the intent of whoever it is was piloting them at the time might be. Obviously, we had the same concerns, but we nonetheless stepped up and landed the planes and the 30,000 passengers who occupied them, including in communities like Gander, Newfoundland, population at the time 9,600, where 6,000 US-bound passengers, there's no tourist infrastructure to speak of in Gander, Newfoundland, but 6,000 US-bound passengers spent the better part of a week developing very close relationships, living in the homes of folks in Gander, Newfoundland. This is replicated the East Coast and the West Coast alike. The Canadian government quickly accepted the Bush administration's request that we join the coalition in Afghanistan. We did not accept the opportunity to join the coalition of the willing in Iraq, however. Our fighting role in Afghanistan lasted 10 years, or almost 10 years. We were principally responsible during that time for the coalition's position in Kandahar province, in the southeast, on the Pakistani border. We took a disproportionate share of casualties. We remain in Afghanistan as trainers of the Afghan National Army. A year ago, the President and the Prime Minister Stephen Harper of Canada, met at the White House and proclaimed something that they called a shared vision for perimeter and perimeter security and economic competitiveness. On December the 7th, they met again, also at the White House, and released 2 action plans that both governments developed over the course of the intervening 10 months. The objective, in brief, is to move security screening increasingly to the perimeter of North America, where we would employ common standards of screening and scrutiny on everything and everyone coming into our countries, thereby making it possible to improve the flow of goods and people across the actual shared border itself. As President Obama put it, we're going to make it easier to conduct the trade and travel that creates jobs, and we're going to make it harder for those who would do us harm and threaten our security. The action plans come with specific implementation dates for dozens of initiatives that the two countries have committed to. The US-Canada Regulatory Cooperation Council will examine the gamut of regulatory differences between our two countries on goods and services that are commonly traded, with the objective of eliminating those that significantly slow scrutiny at the border without achieving meaningfully different health, environmental, or public safety standards. Increasingly, we'll coordinate in the first instance to reduce the possibility of our ending up with different regulations on the same product or service. Businesses, in our view, have enough burdens as it is. It's time to reduce them. The Beyond the Border initiative is not just about fixing the border, however. It's about eliminating barriers that constrain the potential for job growth. It's vitally important for both of our countries, not just for Canada, to get the border right. It's one of the predicates to achieving the kind of job growth that we're all seeking. For the most part, relations at the most senior levels have been excellent between the US President and the Canadian Prime Minister. When President Roosevelt inaugurated the Thousand Islands Bridge between Ontario and New York State in 1938, he said, quote, "This bridge stands as an open door. There will be no challenge at the border and no guard to ask a countersign. Where the boundary is crossed, the words must be pass, friend." President Truman observed in 1947 that Canada and the United States, I'm quoting, have now reached the point where we can no longer think of each other as foreign countries. Somehow that failed to incite Canadian nationalists who generally regard Canada always in the context of our relationship with the United States. John Kennedy, your new articulate president, came to Ottawa and spoke to our parliament in 1961 and said, quote, "Those whom nature hath so joined together, let no man put asunder." President Ford intervened after the first G5 summit, which took place in France in 1975, and secured Canadian membership in what became the G7. Italy was added as well. Prime Minister Mulroney worked hand in hand with President George H.W. Bush to build the international coalition to secure UN endorsement of the first Gulf War. Occasionally, however, there have been small bumps in the road. One of those came in April of 1965 when our Prime Minister, Lester Pearson, took the extraordinary step during a speech at Philadelphia's Temple University of voicing his support for a pause in the American bombing of North Vietnam so that a diplomatic solution to the crisis might unfold. The Johnson administration erupted. Even before Pearson finished giving his speech, he was summoned the next day to Camp David to see President Johnson, who reportedly greeted Pearson by grabbing his lapels and shaking him and saying, "Don't you come into my living room and piss on my rug." Now, only twice today am I using a little bit off-color language, but both times I'm quoting US presidents, so that probably makes it okay, eh? Prime Minister Trudeau often vocally disagreed with the US Cold War policies. At a press conference in 1971, he opined that the US posed, and I'm quoting, "a danger to our," meaning Canadian, "national identity from a cultural, economic, and perhaps even military point of view." Subsequently, President Nixon was quoted referring to Trudeau as that asshole, to which second of two, to which Trudeau replied, "I've been called worse things by better people." But even leaders who sometimes disagreed with one another reached accommodations important to our countries. President Johnson and Prime Minister Pearson instituted the Automotive Pact that I referred to, and President Nixon and Prime Minister Trudeau signed the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in 1972, a mechanism that's been updated several times since and is about to be once again. The agreement has provided the framework for much of the cleanup of the Great Lakes that has taken place during the ensuing 40 years. What occasioned the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, among other things, was the fact that back in the 1950s and 60s, the Cuyahoga River running through Cleveland into Lake Erie perennially caught on fire. and it was deemed that clearly there was a problem that needed to be mitigated. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement has gone some distance towards achieving that goal. The Cuyahoga River doesn't any longer catch on fire. In short, American and Canadian leaders have well understood their joint responsibility for responsible, constructive, and creative shared management of the continent. That, we must hope, will continue to pertain well into the future. Our shared energy and environmental relationship constitutes a great opportunity for more of the kind of collaboration that has worked so well for both of our countries. We discovered after the Kyoto Protocol was signed in 1997 that two countries sharing a continent with heavily integrated economies who are one another's best customers cannot pursue significantly divergent policies on climate change, for example. We're committed, consistent with NAFTA's energy chapter, to North American energy integration and, if possible, North American energy self-sufficiency. Guaranteed access to Canadian energy supplies was one of the USA's principal NAFTA objectives. In discharge of that commitment, we proceeded to develop our resources, which in the case of oil are the world's third largest, after only Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. In the process, we've become the USA's largest supplier of imported oil, of natural gas, electricity, and uranium. We now supply more than a fifth, approaching a quarter, of American oil imports, more than you buy from Saudi Arabia and Iraq put together. However, mixed signals have recently been sent as to whether, in fact, the US wants the resource on a continuing basis. The Canadian company had an application before the US State Department for 3 years seeking approval of the so-called Keystone XL pipeline from central Alberta to the US Gulf Coast, where refineries that currently lack a source of oil would process it, with much of the refined product then being shipped via existing pipelines to the Midwest, including to Indiana. Last year, Indiana's state senate, with a bipartisan majority, passed a resolution in support of the oil sands and the pipeline. Hopefully that initiative will be taken in Washington as an important indication of middle American opinion. At least we hope so. Senator Lugar, I should add, has been one of the key leaders in Washington pushing for a positive decision on this project. I served at our embassy for 8 years, from 1990 to 94, and again from 2006 to 2010. Interacted a lot with Senator Richard Lugar and his staff. It seemed to me then, it seems to me now, that if there's anybody in Washington who truly gets the geostrategic attractiveness of possible North American energy self-sufficiency, it's your senior U.S. Senator. In addition to your state Senate, and Senators Lugar and Senator Coates for that matter, Governor Daniels, several Hoosier members of Congress, including Representative Young, prominent Indiana mayors, the Indiana Chamber of Commerce, and many leaders of labor unions in this state have also endorsed Canadian oil sands development in general and the KXL pipeline in particular. This is truly, in our perception, a common sense initiative. We're grateful to so many Indiana leaders for speaking up in support. While we were disappointed about President Obama's decision last month to reject the application, we understand fully, the President and the Prime Minister directly, that it was a rejection based on process and not based on substance. Our energy relationship remains strong. We'll continue to work with your country to find ways for both of us to enhance North American energy security. Before taking your questions, which we'll do in a moment, let me conclude with a few words on our shared border, the longest in the world, and what's being done to make it more efficient while still providing both countries with the security assurances that we need. And this is a message that I've hammered home a little bit while in Indiana, including with Senator Simpson in Indianapolis on Wednesday. Modern border infrastructure linking Indiana to Canada at Detroit and Port Huron is essential to existing and future trade. Renewal of that infrastructure provides necessary confidence to Hoosier companies whose business plans depend on moving goods quickly and efficiently to or from Canada. It also fosters a climate conducive to the growth and expansion in the transportation and logistics sectors. Indiana's total trade, as I've explained, is high, it's growing. More than $10 billion of that trade with Canada moves by truck, and almost all of that crosses the 83-year-old Ambassador Bridge linking Detroit to Windsor, meaning that perhaps 100,000 jobs in Indiana depend on everything working just right every day at a bridge that's 30 years older rather, than the Sherman-Minton Bridge at Louisville, southern Indiana, that was found last September to have catastrophic cracks, was closed for 6 months, and has just reopened in the last few days. There they had options. In Detroit, they don't. The numbers of jobs in neighboring states in the industrial heartland that depend on trade with Canada, in Illinois, in Ohio, in Michigan, is even higher than the numbers in Indiana. So this is a project of regional importance, not just of local importance in Michigan. It should therefore be obvious to everybody why that project has become Canada's #1 national infrastructure priority. It would be a public-private partnership. It requires, however, an agreement of one sort or another between Michigan and Canada. Therein lies the rub. We haven't been able to get that, notwithstanding the fact that successive governors of Michigan have supported the project. The Ohio State Senate spoke up in each of the last 2 years, unanimously in fact, endorsing the bridge. It won't cost Ohio anything, it won't cost Michigan anything either, and it won't cost Indiana anything either, which is why I hope there might be some receptivity to my suggestion to Senator Simpson and to the Senate President, Senator Long, that perhaps Indiana might want to express its voice in support of this project as well. Prudent governments act to ensure that when it comes to critical infrastructure, there's sufficient redundancy to allow economies to continue to function in the event of serious accident, terrorist attacks, or catastrophic failure. Building the new international trade crossing, as it's come to be known, will create more than 10,000 direct construction jobs during the 4-year period. Most of those will be in southeast Michigan, to be sure, but the impact on the climate of confidence throughout the region will be great. There you have it. Virtually 2 centuries of partnership, despite the occasional blip. Indiana and Canada derive great benefits from being almost next-door neighbors, sharing common bonds through trade, security, energy, environment, and in numerous other areas. And there's great promise, in our view, for the future. In other words, we've got a lot to be thankful for. Let's nurture and build this relationship, would be our advice, and make sure that the payoffs from it only continue to grow for both of our countries. Thank you all for your attentiveness. I'm available for as long as any of you are available and interested I don't think the next thing is, what, till 11:45, Dennis, or something like? So we've got lots of time, if you're interested, to answer questions relating to any of this, or for that matter, relating to anything else. Dr. O'Meara was pretty unrestrained in the range of questions that he asked me, so you should feel equally invited to talk about whatever. But thank you very much for your attentiveness.
I do want to thank Dr. Norton for a very compact and incisive history of U.S.-Canadian relations and the current economic partnership that exists between them. We do have plenty of time for questions and answers. I'll help sort out the applicants for that with the questioning part of that you prepare the answer. So please feel free to ask questions, and we do mean ask questions. You can say something else, but there should be a question in it. This is a game of Jeopardy in that sense.
Identify yourself if you will.
Hi, my name's Jessica. So you had mentioned that the issue of energy security and with the Keystone pipeline from the U.S. just getting more of their oil resources from Canada versus other sources in places throughout the world that may be less stable and less close by. But I have in front of me the Keystone XL Trans-Canada application in the Market and Supply Section 3, and it said that the vast majority of the Western Canadian crude oil, around like 89% of it, would be delivered to refineries and markets other than the United States close market. So I'm wondering if you can shed some light on like what that statistic is about.
Well, I don't think you have before you their application. I think you might have some group's analysis of the application. the vast majority of the oil that will come, the 800,000 barrels of oil per day that will come through the pipeline will be consumed in the United States. What won't be consumed, and some folks have gone to some length to make something of this, the folks who've done that should probably visit a refinery. A barrel of oil that's refined yields a number of different products, including a certain percentage of diesel. The United States, relative to Europe and other parts of the world, has no particular, or we don't in Canada either, has no huge appetite for diesel. We don't drive a fleet of diesel-fueled automobiles. And so the proportion of the barrel that's refined into diesel fuel will indeed be exported because there's no demand for it here at the moment. It doesn't mean that there won't be a growing demand in the future. But overwhelmingly, the product that comes through that pipeline will be consumed in the United States. In fact, it's important to underscore that 100,000 of the 800,000 barrels a day will come from the Bakken oil field of northeastern Montana and western North Dakota, which is substantially landlocked today. In other words, this pipeline actually increases U.S. energy self-sufficiency. The governor of Montana, Brian Schweitzer, a Democrat, went on a bit of a rant yesterday, saying that the people in Washington, he didn't identify anybody by name. He's a supporter of President Obama, so he probably didn't mean President Obama. But the people in Washington who tied this in knots are, in his term, jackasses. He said the pipeline will be built. He talked about the fact that oil from his state is now having to be shipped by train at a cost of about $30 a barrel more than would be the case if it went through the pipeline, making it substantially uneconomic. And shipping by train is environmentally a lot less sound than shipping oil from through the pipeline. Others? Sir.
My name's Evan Davies. I'm a graduate student at the Public Affairs School here. So a lot of what you've talked about has been sort of positions by the U.S. and Canada to promote trade, and a lot of that's done at the federal level. But my question is regarding sort of what the state of Indiana can do to increase trade with Canada. So I guess what kind of policies does Canada, would Canada like to see from states, like particularly that you serve in the industrial heartland of the U.S.? Is it taxes? Is it infrastructure? Is it just general business climate? So I guess my question is specifically related to policies that are within the jurisdiction of the states themselves.
Well, let's go to the bridge first. Ever since 1972, when Congress passed a law specifying that henceforth infrastructure connecting the United States to Canada would be the responsibility jointly of Canada and the state on the receiving end instead of the U.S. Ever since 1972, that has pertained, and as a result, this effort to get the new bridge built between Detroit and Windsor, in fact, requires approval by the state of Michigan. Michigan, as a result, has authority over something that, as I indicated in my remarks, doesn't pertain, however, just to Michigan. It has impacts across the region. So there's an example of an initiative that can be taken at the state level to approve this, and we can get into why that hasn't happened. It's a rather sordid story, but it would have a huge impact in the first instance on Michigan, but also on the whole region. Secondly, I talked a little bit about protectionist policies. I talked about the advent of the stimulus package, the Recovery Act, and the phenomenon whereby Canadian companies couldn't bid on federally funded projects. There are instances of Canadian companies not being able to bid on state-funded projects. Indiana has a state preference policy when it comes to government procurement. As in state government procurement, Indiana companies are given a preference. And it's perfectly understandable on its face why that seems like a good idea. Why would you not advantage local companies? The problem is that, or the challenge is that Indiana, as I said, has a trade surplus with Canada. You export more to Canada than you buy. Indiana would like, I'm not engaging in a full frontal attack here, I don't want to exaggerate the extent of the problem, but Indiana would like Indiana companies to be able to continue to bid on procurement opportunities led by the government of Ontario or the government of Quebec or whatever, but don't want to extend the same opportunity, the same level playing field to companies from. Now, Canadian politicians are responsive to demands from Canadian populations. Maybe as much as Indiana politicians, maybe less, maybe more, depending on the issue and the time. But it's not hard to imagine that there could come a time when Canadian companies, having been denied opportunities, I'll give you an example in Ohio. You asked about states in my area, so Ohio's a good case in point. In 2010, in the fall of 2010, Franklin County, Ohio, that encompasses Columbus, had just completed a new courthouse, and they were tendering for furniture for the courthouse. They let a tender, a Canadian company, Krug, bid for the furniture, tables and chairs. Krug is a pretty established company. There is Krug furniture in the Oval Office of the White House. So it's a company that historically has enjoyed access to US procurement opportunities and clearly provides quality product. Krug won. And the county commissioners, one of them, Paula Brown in particular, were determined, however, that it was inappropriate that a Canadian company should provide furniture. I should say that the furniture was going to be made as in the components of the furniture were going to be made in Canada, but it was going to be assembled in Ohio by an Ohio company. So 50% of the value added was in fact in Ohio. She prevailed, and there had to be a retendering process. They, for whatever bizarre reason, decided, however, to allow Krug to bid again. And so Krug did, and lo and behold, they won the second time with a bid lower than their first one. She didn't like this. She spoke out. I talked to a number of officials, talked to the dispatch. There were some stories that frankly were quite helpful to us because they simply laid out the facts, the absurdity of the situation in Columbus. But nonetheless, she prevailed to the extent of causing the thing to be tendered a third time. Meanwhile, the courthouse can't be used. It's completed, but there's no place for anybody, nothing for anybody to sit on. So months of delay ensue, during the course of which the thing can't be opened because it isn't functional. Finally, third time round, Krug won again, and this time Paula Brown relented, and Krug has supplied the furniture, and the courthouse has been inaugurated, and it's functioning well, and there's been no further expression of concern. There are other examples in Ohio. Frankly, there have been no examples, no significant ones in Indiana. So our problems have been more with Ohio than Indiana. But the risk is that Canadian companies, if they felt discriminated against, would speak up, and the Canadians would say, hey, this is unfair, and that Canadian politicians would react, and you would end up with a mini trade war, which in our view doesn't serve anybody's interests and will probably cause the total volume of trade to diminish and would probably see a diminution in Indiana's surplus with Canada and would see fewer than 162,300 Hoosiers with jobs dependent on trade with Canada. So we just don't think it works. I talked about Canada inadvertently being sideswiped. This can happen at the state as well as the national level. Usually these policies, there's a positive reason for the policies, but there's also sometimes an impetus or a motivation to penalize somebody else. And the somebody else, more often than not these days, is China. We aren't China. And we don't compete with the United States firms on any of the levels that people think Chinese firms are competing with US firms. And so maybe policies need to be designed with a little bit more sophistication, recognizing the inherent integration between the inherently different nature of the US-Canada trade relationship relative to the US trade relationship with anybody else. I think there was another, sir.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the little more on the bridge story before you said that there was sort of stories. So what's the reason that Michigan's had for not participating?
The existing bridge that carries a quarter of all US-Canada trade, and by value is the most important border crossing in the world, is owned by an 84-year-old billionaire. There are 27 bridge crossings between Canada and the United States. 25 of them are publicly owned, and 2 of them are privately owned. The one that carries by far the most traffic, and the one that carries by far the least traffic, which is owned by a logging company in northwest Minnesota, northwest Ontario, that has sawmills on both sides of the Francis River, and they're pretty much the only people that use it. The Ambassador Bridge owners, fundamentally, enjoy a monopoly, and they're not interested in competition, which is perfectly understandable from their point of view. However, the implications for the region are so pronounced. 2 million, carries a quarter of the US-Canada trade relationship. 8 million jobs in the US depend on the trade relationship. So 2 million Americans are essentially being held hostage by a private entrepreneur who doesn't want to have a competing bridge. Now, there would be scope for both to be profitable, and Canada in any event has agreed to backstop fully the new one in the event that it were not to be profitable. We'll take the risk, and will ensure in the course of so doing that if at some point the bridge falls down or can't function for whatever reason, that there will still be capacity. They have spent in the last spring, they launched a multi-million-dollar, it's calculated at $6.5 million, advertising campaign in Michigan, designed to impress upon Michiganders that the bridge would cost $2 billion, and it would cost Michigan $100 million a year to operate. Both assertions are completely untrue. The bridge will cost $1 billion, but it doesn't matter how much the bridge is going to cost because it's going to be a public-private partnership with the private sector bringing all of the money to the table to build it, and Canada will guarantee any losses, and it will literally not cost Michigan a dime any year. And after 45 years, when the thing is paid back, Canada is actually, the extent of our generosity knows no bounds. We are going to, the cost that would have been Michigan's would have been up to $550 million to build a connection from the foot of the new bridge to I-75. But if we were having a debate with Michigan over that $550 million, this thing would be going nowhere at all. And so Canada said, fine, we'll pay the $550 million and we'll wait in line after the private entrepreneur that brings the billion. And so we calculate from year 25 to year 45, we'll get paid back our $550 million. From year 45, for the remainder of the 125-year lifespan of the bridge, i.e. the ensuing 80 years, each of Canada and Michigan, it's calculated, would receive $50 million per year in revenue. So Michigan accesses a long-term revenue stream of $50 million starting 45 years from now and continuing for 85 years at absolutely no cost. But the constituents have been so poisoned by this advertising campaign and have placed so much pressure on their legislators that legislators are loath to approve it. Those self-same legislators, they don't restrict themselves to advertising campaigns. They spend some additional millions of dollars per year in providing funding to candidates' campaigns. And that's, at least some of it's public, but the owners of the bridge have a pretty Byzantine labyrinth of companies, and so whether it's all known or not, we don't know. But those self-same legislators are disinclined to vote on it. They don't want to vote against it because they would be standing up and saying that they have no capability to assess right from wrong. So they just keep kicking it down the road and avoiding a decision. And the governor heretofore has felt that he couldn't do this himself. He may be changing his mind. He may be looking to legislative authorities such as he has to see if it's possible to proceed without a specific legislative authority from the House and Senate. That would be more complex. It's less than optimum, but to get it done, it may be necessary to go there. And in the meantime, signals of support from neighboring states, it certainly has, it's caught the attention of an awful lot of commentators in Michigan that Ohio has endorsed the bridge. Ohio does $32 billion in trade with Canada, half as much as Michigan and twice as much almost as Indiana. And half of it crosses the Ambassador Bridge. And they clearly have concluded that their companies are at grave risk going forward if transportation capacity is not there on a reliable basis. So they've sent the signal, and we're hopeful that Indiana legislators might be willing to do the same. Sir?
In an op-ed that you published in September of last year, you claimed that, quote, for projects in Canada's oil sands, they are also subject to extensive environmental and regulatory review. We manage water by setting control limits. We work with a wide range of stakeholders to regulate water quality, end quote. However, in a secret memo obtained 4 days ago from the Canadian Privy County Office, the federal office found that collateral damage from Canada's booming oil sands may be pretty irreversible, posing a, quote, significant environmental and financial risk to the province of Alberta, and that the so-called tailing ponds of toxic waste from oil sands could permanently damage Alberta's landscape. Another quote, while the industry has taken steps to recycle water and collaborate on the development of innovative tailing management technologies, at this point in time, it is far from clear that the tailing ponds can be adequately restored. Could you speak to a little more what this means to the reputability of Canadian oil?
The memo principally addresses the reputational consequences for Alberta and Canada globally. In other words, it's talking about perception rather more than reality. And unquestionably, the perception exists in some quarters that Canada is raping its environment. I've been to the oil sands. I've seen reclaimed land. It looks indistinguishable from the land that had never been mined in the first instance. Forests, animals. There are a number of different ways to come at this. One of them has to do with the way in which the oil is now secured. The oil in the Alberta oil sands is encased with sand. It's not like Saudi Arabian sweet crude where you put a stick in the ground and up it comes. You have to separate the oil from the sand. And heretofore, to this point, most of that has happened in, if you like, an open pit mining process, whereby large equipment, a lot of it supplied by Caterpillar, has scraped out the sand, trucked it off to upgraders, where it's been heated. The sand is separated from oil. Oil is sent through a pipeline. Sand is taken and put back in open pit mines that no longer are being mined. Increasingly, and going forward, this will constitute the majority of the development. This process is done in situ, whereby no longer is land mined, but instead steam is injected into the ground, oil is separated from the sand underground, the oil comes up, I've seen this as well, oil comes up, sand remains in its place, and it looks like a farmer's field with some buildings on it. You literally wouldn't be able to distinguish it from an Indiana cornfield. And that, given the depth of where most of the oil is, that is the way in which the oil, for the most part going forward, will be secured. As a result, there's no need for diversion of any water from rivers, or there'll be much less need. As it is, 4% of the Athabasca River has been diverted at any given time. But going forward, what they use groundwater that's brackish, it's not potable, and they heat that water and use it to create the steam that they inject. Some other important factoids, though. There's a perception that, as I said, we're destroying our landscape. The total area, the total mined area of the oil sands, it's been going on for 40 years, is 239 square miles, the size of El Paso, Texas, or Huntsville, Alabama, or Davenport, Iowa. Now, if you lived in those communities, that might seem like a really big area. We have 3 million square miles in Canada. We're talking about 239 square miles of it. It will grow, but there are real limitations on how much it can grow. Secondly, if you want to talk about the emissions, and the government of Canada has committed to exactly the same targets, made exactly the same commitments as President Obama's administration has, to reduce Canada's and the United States' greenhouse gas emissions by 17% based on 2005 levels by 2020. So, and we're actually on target to do that. Now, we're on target in part, maybe principally, you might say, because of the effects of the recession, as in there's been less economic activity, so you haven't seen growth, you've actually seen some decline. But progress is being made. We're in lockstep. We're frankly not going to, just as the United States isn't going to unilaterally disarm economically vis-a-vis China and India, Canada's not going to unilaterally disarm economically vis-a-vis the United States. We're an integrated economy. So a lot of folks in Canada, Prime Minister Chrétien signed the Kyoto Protocol, and Canada essentially did nothing. Why did we do nothing? Because the United States did nothing. President Clinton signed the Kyoto Protocol, came back, barely had gotten off the plane before the US Senate equipped him with a resolution 97-0, i.e. every Democrat and every Republican saying, don't submit the Kyoto Protocol to us for approval because we won't approve it. And it became clear that nothing much was going to happen in the United States, and maybe we're using this as an excuse, but nothing much happened in Canada as a result. But on the notion of greenhouse gas emissions and their consequence, and we believe in climate change. The government of Canada believes that carbon emitted into the atmosphere is contributing to climate change. There's no theological issue in Canada on that subject. The oil sands, in the most recent year for which there's statistics, which is 2010, emitted 45 megatons of carbon. Coal-fired electricity generation in Indiana the same year emitted 102 megatons. There are 11 US states that emit, just from coal-fired electricity generation, that emit more carbon than the oil sands. And cumulatively, those 11 states emit 17 times as much as the Alberta oil sands. So this monolithic problem, cast in perspective, may not be quite so large after all. And it's an issue to be addressed. We're committed to addressing it. Every bit of carbon emitted is equally damaging. And maybe people who get as worked up as they do about the Alberta oil sands might be well advised to focus some attention as well on other emitters, including domestic emitters, including, for that matter, in Indiana. Now, we think that the geostrategic importance of the Alberta oil sands is such that, frankly, it's a no-brainer, in our view, as to why it is you should be developing this. The pipeline will carry 800,000 barrels a day, which is exactly the amount of oil every day that the United States imports from Venezuela. As it happens, Alberta oil sands oil and Venezuelan oil are of comparable consistency. They don't have to mine it, but in Venezuela it's heavy oil, or heavier oil than Saudi sweet crude, and the emissions associated with the production and burning of that oil are almost identical to that of the Alberta oil sands oil, which is about 6% dirtier, as it were, than wheel to wheel than what Saudi sweet crude is. The 800,000 barrels of oil per day from Venezuela occasion a transfer from the United States to Venezuela of $30 billion per year. I read in yesterday's New York Times that President Chavez, and let's be clear, while the Alberta oil sands development is all private sector, under government regulation, in Venezuela it's a government-run operation, and it's a government that rarely agrees with anything that the United States does. So President Chavez of Venezuela, according to the New York Times yesterday, is sending oil to Bashar Assad in Syria. The United States, Canada, other countries concerned about what's going on there are at the same time trying to promote peaceful change. Last year, Chavez was sending money to Muammar Gaddafi to combat the rebels at the same time as the United States Air Force, the Canadian Air Force, the British and the French Air Forces were trying to enforce a no-fly zone in Libya. Is there a logic to this? Canadians can deal with the United States not wanting Canadian oil if you have substantially reduced your consumption to the point whereby you don't need oil. We have some trouble dealing with the notion that you would effectively prefer to buy it from Hugo Chavez than from Canada, because overwhelmingly the economic benefits to the United States of the development of oil in Canada vastly exceed those of the development of oil in Venezuela. 60 cents of every dollar invested in the Alberta oil sands development returns to the United States. We have a very high propensity to buy American capital equipment, services, and technology. This does not pertain for any US oil development anywhere in the world, save and except here in the United States. So it's economically beneficial, it is geostrategically beneficial. As you work towards reducing your oil consumption, TransCanada Pipeline Company will take a risk. At some point in the future, you will have successfully reduced your consumption to the point whereby you will no longer need Canadian oil. And then TransCanada Pipeline will own a $7 billion pipeline with nobody wanting anything coming out the other end. Hopefully they will have paid for it by then. But they're prepared to take that risk. That's their problem. All the states that it will cross have approved the pipeline. Their environmental authorities have approved the pipeline at the state level, and their legislative authorities have approved the pipeline. So, choice is yours. You would, by the way, you're not, you know this I'm sure, you're not near getting to the point whereby you don't need the oil. You import, you essentially consume, let's for easy math say 20 million barrels a day. It's about 18, 19. You import half of it. If you wanted to set a goal of reducing your oil consumption by a quarter, pretty significant reduction. Today, to reduce your oil consumption by a quarter, you literally, one way to do it would be to take half of all of the cars and trucks off the road in America. You could, if you did that today, tomorrow you would require 25% less oil. And if you require 25% less oil, you would require 50% less imports. So the issue then becomes not whether you're buying the oil, not whether you're consuming the oil, but who it is you buy it from. And do you buy it from friend and ally, good old Canada, or do you buy it from Chavez? Do you do as Tom Friedman, the columnist in the New York Times, periodically asserts, continue to finance both sides in the war on terror, whereby you send lots of money to Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Middle East, and then you send your military, also paying for that, to contain the effects in the Middle East of uses of those revenues for nefarious purposes that aren't consistent with US geostrategic interests. All of which causes us again to say that this seems pretty straightforward and why it is we think that Keystone XL makes sense. But we sit on the world's third largest energy reserve. It's not up to American environmentalists or anybody else to decide that it's not going to be developed. It's going to be developed. If it were in your country, it would be developed. The Prime Minister of Canada, not wishing to be provocative, a few weeks back said Canada is not a northern national park for the United States. We're a sovereign G7 industrial economy. We're going to develop the energy. The Chinese want it. He went to China in the second week of February and signed an energy cooperation agreement with the Chinese. We're committed to building a pipeline to the West Coast so as to be able to sell it to China, Japan, and others. That will have a beneficial impact, by the way, on the global energy market, as in introducing, we can go from 2 million barrels a day to 5 million. Introducing 3 million additional barrels of oil per day into the international marketplace would have a considerable stabilizing effect on global energy prices. That 3 million barrels, coincidentally, is exactly how much Iran sells into the international market every day. And maybe one outcome of all of this is that the world can say to Iran, keep your oil, and pay no price for saying to Iran, keep your oil, as compared to the price that appears to be being paid right now, whereby, and it's being priced into the market right now, and you see this in gas prices that are going north, whereby the market is apprehensive that globally it might find itself denied access to 3 million barrels per day with attendant consequences. Sorry for going on as I did. More? Sir?
I want to just ask a question about the automotive industry, because I think it's Indiana's largest export to Canada is parts and vehicles, and like the U.S. automotive industry is still recovering from what Detroit, the big GM and Chrysler went through. And so sort of, I wonder if you could just touch on some of the challenges that the U.S. automotive sector has and what that means for Canada.
Yeah, I have one of my two automotive experts in the office here, Ann Cascadden, who may well want to supplement whatever it is I have to say. The industry obviously went through a hellish time. It's coming back quite nicely, not yet where it was, probably won't get to where it was, in fact, but seems to be finding ways to be profitable again at less production than was the case before. Canada, I should take care in advertising this, but Canada actually assembles more, the province of Ontario assembles more vehicles than Michigan or any other state. Now, I know where I stand at the moment. I'm in a state that's a major automotive producer. You might feel threatened by that. You shouldn't, because the Center for Automotive Research at Michigan, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, did a study in 2010 showing that of major components like powertrain, more than 60% of the car that comes off the assembly line in Canada is in fact US content. Again, underpinning or underscoring just how integrated the industry is. The parts industry is obviously highly dependent on the success of the assemblers, and it was the existence of not just the assembly industry, but the parts industry in Canada that provoked the government of Canada and the government of Ontario to join with the government of the United States of America in 2009 and bail out GM and Chrysler. Again, we're not very theological on that issue in Canada. We thought that made sense, and we still think it makes sense. GM's repaid all of its loans. We still own shares of GM. We still own part of Chrysler, and in due course, we're confident we'll be paid back. Whether we're paid back 100 cents on the dollar or not, we don't know. But we literally think that hundreds of thousands of jobs in Canada would have been eclipsed, would have simply evaporated, given the assembly and the parts industry and all of the spin-off jobs that come from And perhaps 1 million jobs or more in the United States might have been at risk. So we think it was a sound public policy decision. It was a conservative government that took the decision in Canada and is unapologetic about having done so. It's not frequently commented in Detroit that the bailout was a 3-government enterprise. It's assumed that this was something the U.S. government did by itself. If we hadn't been willing to put, we're talking Ontario and Canada together, $14 billion or thereabouts, I mean, a pretty significant chunk of change. And if we hadn't bailed out the Canadian subsidiaries, that would have served as an additional drain on the parent companies. So they're coming back in both of our countries. Canadian consumption of cars has remained above U.S. consumption, as in on a proportionate to population basis, reflective in part of the fact that our economy never really declined as much as the U.S. economy did. So Canadians, it declined. We've gotten back all the jobs that we lost during the recession. That doesn't pertain here. But Canadians have felt capable of continuing to buy. And we in Canada have always bought smaller cars, or at least for the longest time we bought smaller cars. The fleet that's sold in Canada is rather more energy efficient than the fleet that's sold in the United States. We don't buy as many trucks. We buy 4-cylinder engines instead of V6s and V8s. Not because we think we're special, just because gasoline is substantially more expensive in Canada, probably by about $1 a gallon. All of the difference being tax, and that's been a deliberate government policy, both nationally and at the provincial level, and that serves unquestionably as an incentive to people to buy smaller, less consumptive of gasoline cars. Anything else?
We reached a breaking point.
Good breaking
Very
point.
much.
You're most
Thank you
welcome.
all for coming.
Thank you all.
Please stop and get a brochure if you want one. Dr. Norton is welcome, and I'm sure that you would also be willing to chat with you.
Sure. Yep, happy to do that.
Thank you very much.
Bye.